Hello, this is a spoiler-filled exploration of the first act or area of Obsidian Studios' fantasy RPG Avowed. I'm going to look primarily at its writing with references to larger gameplay and world design when it's relevant. I'm rating this with a development philosophy set out here by gameplay director Carrie Patel in mind.
We always have to think of things in terms of basically gold, silver, and bronze tier information. And you want to be as sparing as possible, I think, with what you really put in that gold tier, because that's the stuff that you're saying, okay, even the player who is speeding through dialogue, kind of just getting from one combat to the next, this is the thing that they really have to understand.
I spoke in my video last week about some theories as to why both changing attention spans and how Xbox Game Pass might have something to do with these priorities, but whether or not those were the causes, it's a philosophy that comes through clearly in the game, and something that I don't think says as much about the writing talent of the people involved as it does about the motivations this game was being made under. This is also going to be very accessible if you're the kind of person who knows they won't play this game, or just prefers to experience game stories secondhand in general. Let's start with the game's setting. Avowed opens with an explanation that some people in the game's world, Aora, a setting established in the much different Pillars of Eternity games, are born with visible abnormalities because they have a spiritual connection to one of the world's pantheon of gods. Because you're one of those people, a godlike, albeit with your patron god shrouded in mystery, the Emperor of the colonial empire Adir has tasked you with traveling to the living lands to solve the mystery of the Dream Scourge, an epidemic which is driving the continent's inhabitants mad. The presence of Adir is not welcomed by the collection of independent, semi-collaborative city-states currently inhabiting the living lands. You arrive in Paradise, the most stable of said settlements, which has very slowly seen Adir encroach on its authority. The implicit threat of violence causing greater concessions of city laws to a decreasingly benevolent invader. This is where the problems immediately present themselves, because that gold tier information that people resent Adir's presence is restated so many times.
Just stop complaining that we don't take everything as seriously as you joyless lot!
Adir's had their boots on Paradise since their first soldiers came.
Me and Pod, we aren't so fond of Outlanders.
Unfortunately, the presence of so many Adiran troops and the rumored exploits of the Steel Garrote paladins supporting them is only making a tense situation worse.
We imposed order, and now they oppose us.
So, how long do you think it'll be before the locals realize how much good we're doing for them?
Every bit is there for the player who has Netflix or a podcast going on another screen while trying out that new Skyrim game. There is interesting dimension to the setting that emerges quickly. The Adiran presence has two semi-distinct factions: the normal Adiran soldiers with their associated level-headed but pompous diplomat, as well as the Steel Garrote, a faction of religious fanatics more loyal to the highly esteemed god of law and order Wodaka than Adir's actual mortal ruler. While some subset of Adiran soldiers will at least play at diplomacy and high-minded aspirations of benevolence, the Garrote and its paladins fundamentally see anyone in their way as footrests. They don't care about the Dream Scourge, they care about pacifying the locals. Both the Adiran Empire and Steel Garrote have similarities to previous Obsidian factions in their perhaps most successful work, Fallout New Vegas. That game portrayed the conflicts between the dysfunctional New California Republic and the brutal dictatorship of Caesar's Legion. Avowed reimagines an exploration of those forces as more of a good cop, bad cop relationship. The Adiran army doesn't seem bloodthirsty. Many of the soldiers on the ground express genuine buy-in to the idea they're here to help people, and some are just doing their jobs. One of the best early conversations is with a woman at a crossroads who you learn joined up with the Empire in an attempt to avoid prison service for a previous life as a thief. She's not stoked on the Empire and doesn't really seem to feel either way about what she's doing, but there's a palpable sort of long-lived acceptance of her lot in life over a reflexive nationalism. But you'll still find Adiran guards standing over dead bodies of locals with perhaps cloudy justification. And then there's their alliance to the Garrote. The Steel Garrote aren't any more morally ambiguous than Caesar's Legion. Their leader has a skeleton mask, flaming eyes, and the name of the order means strong wire used to strangle people to death. They're the bad guys. But it's their relationship to Adir that's more interesting, where the lines between spreader of freedom and conqueror get blurred. The dynamic is best shown with Tig, the secretary at the Adiran embassy, who is one of the NPCs you can ask the most questions of early in the game. You get the the picture of a somewhat stuck-up man barely hiding a gambling problem who likes to think of himself as an intellectual with tons of knowledge on the area. He finds the Steel Garrote distasteful, and you get the sense he'd be offended to be associated with them directly for their lack of intellectualization, but he nonetheless speaks with admiration for doing what he really wants to be done.
The living lands are a dangerous, lawless frontier in sore need of order. Thus, they are here.
A similar sentiment is echoed by the ambassador himself, who laments at the obstacle to diplomacy the Garrote's brutality present, but secretly writes in his diary about how enchanted he is with Lodwyn, their leader. We've all heard the quote that all evil needs to prevail is for good men to do nothing. But I suspect just as prominent in the perpetuation of evil is those who do not like to look in the mirror and see a murderer or a tyrant, but nonetheless will work to support those they see as such when it benefits them. A nuanced point of distinction between these two factions is not something that can come through for the player who's half paying attention or skipping all the dialogue, however. The highlights I've presented take place deep in conversations that are entirely optional. There's an assumption that anyone asking these questions are in the silver or bronze tiers of information critical stuff, so there's an ability to get into nuances and deeper themes. But it is there, and for a game that's been part of a narrative that Obsidian has simply lost the recipe for writing a good game, there's such evident understanding of what made narrative threads work in the past, both with the origin of these factions in Pillars of Eternity and their similarities to Fallout factions. But my experience was constantly being pulled away from Obsidian writing to be begged to not lose interest in their game. And while for the purposes of this video it felt necessary to begin with scene setting, the point this first manifested for me with was Avowed's companion characters. The first companion, and really first character you meet at all, is Garrick. You are two of the only survivors of your shipwreck when the soldiers that were supposed to receive you in the living lands instead greet you with cannon fire. Garrick is friendly, but immediately betrays an edge when you encounter a prisoner in the outpost dungeons. She says everyone went mad, likely affected by the same disease the Emperor sent you to the living lands to cure. Garrick's friendliness immediately comes into conflict with his fanatical devotion to the Empire, and he's more than willing to leave this woman Yora to die because he trusts the judgments of his dead countrymen more than the living locals standing right in front of him. And he's wrong. Yora becomes your second companion, and she gets you out and fights on your side if you choose to free her. Immediately, you have companions with conflicting allegiances and perhaps unfavorable characteristics. Will Garrick be able to work through his immediate assumptions to develop into someone more accommodating of the local culture? Was there, in fact, a good reason Yora was locked up that simply didn't present itself immediately? Turns out neither. Both are just tutorial companions, and they'll never join your party again after this. Instead, you get Kai. Kai is an Omawa, a super tall kind of shark person. He's voiced by Brendan Keener. He's most famous for his work as Garrus Vakarian in the Mass Effect games, so for a large portion of the people playing Avowed, there's an instant draw toward a familiar kind of scaly sidekick. The problem is the absolute unconstrained loyalty Kai shows for the player from the jump. You have one conversation where you find out you're trying to talk to the same two people having a conversation a mile north, and then you can drag him around with you as your ride or die across 5 or 6 biomes and countless hours of your life. Mechanical awkwardness is somewhat inevitable with games that are trying for this kind of companion recruiting structure, but Kai is made even worse with how frictionless he is, both in your relationship and the way he presents himself. He's good-natured towards all the NPCs you come into contact with, he's nothing but nice to the player, and he's forthcoming with information with none of the bias of Garrick or the mistrust of locals like Yora. This makes him more legible to the player, but also a little closer to Clippy than even the blandest Mass Effect trilogy companions. It's not that Kai's a flat character, there's depth here. He has a violent past both as a mercenary and as a soldier that he largely regrets. His ambivalence towards the big conflicts between Adirans and locals and amongst various factions comes from the fact that he sees them as tragically violent, explaining why he gives you the benefit of the doubt so quickly. He's someone who's been through the ringer, with hindsight making him lend more value to the lives he's intertwined with than those he ended, and a desire to work in favor of kindness over fury. It's all internally consistent, but presents kind of boring. The interesting part of Garrus's journey was watching his relationship to violence and authority evolve across 3 games, potentially to a point where we find Kai. It's not interesting discovering him already there, but it is easy to understand what his deal is if you played the Mass Effect games, or because he'll just fucking tell you.
If this place can't give us misfits and screw-ups a second chance, what hope do we have?
And unfortunately, the same is true of your second permanent party member, Marius. Marius is a dwarf ranger, someone proficient in surviving in the island's most dangerous regions. There's the opportunity for someone interesting here, and it does develop later, but his introduction is so afraid to let him rub the player the wrong way. We meet him having an argument with a local in a bar. He reveals midway through the conversation that he bribed the bartender to poison this man. It's brutal, potentially showing a clever but disturbing cunning. But he reveals quickly afterwards that he's lying, and the person is just just having a psychosomatic response. Marius presents as that person we all know who overplans for everything and gets easily frustrated. The problem is, Kai and him are friends, and Kai is happy to lend his own theories on Marius's behavior, that his anger and irritation towards the player is the way that he shows affection. We're robbed of learning this quirk of his personality because it's the kind of thing that would otherwise come about through closely paying attention. I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 right now, and it's remarkable how frustrating every single early companion is. Shadowheart's incredibly resistant to questions, Lae'zel treats you like cattle, Gale's unbearably vain, Asterion objects to doing anything nice, Will seems like a pickup artist, and okay, maybe Karlach isn't as abrasive in the same way, but that makes her stick out as the exception. They're mostly some kind of grating in a way that makes you want to know more about why they are like that, but could make you reflexively avoid them. They feel like people. It was a breath of fresh air to experience after Avowed. It's not that the developers at Obsidian aren't able to imagine good characters, but the way that all the backstory and motivation that was clearly on paper somewhere translated into these character introductions was far less compelling and clearly prioritized their understandability over their mystery, or a player relationship that felt real and earned. Unfortunately, legibility also seems to be a priority in the central plot. When I hear the word cliché thrown around to criticize writing, it's often with the accusation that a writer is being lazy by falling back on established formulas, but clichés are also more accessible to an audience giving a game minimal attention, or perhaps with large breaks between play sessions. Though Avowed is easy to follow, it often comes at the cost of feeling uninspired, especially in the early hours of the game. One of the first major plot beats of the game happens when you enter the city of Paradis for the first time and are shot with an arrow immediately after walking through the gates. You die, but a mystical presence that speaks only to you brings you back to life. The interesting dimension here is that you defying death doesn't shake anyone's conception of the world. It happens in Eora, but it's rare enough that people want to know why. It's a cool way to explore a world where reincarnation is more or less a scientifically verifiable fact, but the central mystery of who this presence is was pretty uninteresting at first. It just feels like a chosen one story that you've seen a million times before. What is far more incredible from the start is how the main story and side content intersect, and how much work the game puts in to make sure you can find the most interesting stuff if you care to look. Some slight wandering from the main path early on will lead you to a shanty town populated mostly by locals of Paradis who were forced out of the main city as Adirian settlers took up much of the real estate. In my playthrough, I explored the upper areas organically and happened upon a quest with a couple trying to flee the city. You eventually learn that they're fugitives for a crime of self-defense back in Adir. Now that Adir's influence has reached Paradis, they're trying to flee to another part of the continent. Unfortunately, the smugglers offering them a boat fare found out about their Adirian origin and decided to extort them for more money. Thing is, when you confront the smugglers to talk the price down, you find one of them is Yora, if you rescued her in the tutorial. In my playthrough, she vouched for me and got the price down. It was a genuinely surprising acknowledgement of my choices, and it made me want to seek out more side content because it was telling me that if I wanted to see the end of other people's stories, I needed to explore and see everything there is to see before advancing the main quest. And it's not hard to find all of the important side stuff. Of all the side quests I played, I think I had only one example where something wasn't either pointed towards by two different NPCs in the world, or given by an NPC conspicuously placed along a critical path. Obsidian is really hard to pin down stylistically because of how varied their output has been over the years, but this kind of interconnected quest design is a consistent thing. Something might be sacrificed in terms of variety. You're not going to set out in a new direction and find something completely out of left field you'd never have discovered otherwise, but you're also not going to miss that quest. I understand that for some that's immersion breaking, but I think the Avowed team believes that it's more immersion breaking to have to play their game with a guide open to find the most interesting content. It makes Obsidian games feel a bit smaller, but also makes the world more lived in because something happening one place affects something happening elsewhere. I found that couple I mentioned before because there's a guy who asks you to go find some dog tags that seagulls stole on the rooftops, but it's not even the only way the game points you there. There's another NPC you'll definitely run past after coming back from the dead that says, hey, you have some sway as the envoy of Adir, can you help this couple out I know? Pointing you to them and that whole area if you didn't find it before. This game rewards paying attention and engaging with at least the silver content. That's where this game really excels. Some of the loudest criticism of Avowed has come from an objection to its politics though. I've decided to mostly not address this backlash, but to speak quickly in broad strokes, I'd say that people are complaining that the game's politics are heavy-handed, and that its art direction points towards the supposed woke androgyny. To speak to the former, this game has pretty overt references to abortion rights and sex work that I found a little trite but ultimately inoffensive, with the latter falling into an unfortunate pattern of not developing characters beyond their profession. Neither is really as conspicuous though as the LGBTQ characters in Baldur's Gate 3 or that game's messages making fun of anti-refugee sentiment. I think a lot of people jump on a game's politics when they don't like it for other reasons and are pretty inconsistent about doing so. And while Avowed is a much less horny game than Baldur's Gate 3, a lot of the reason people find characters attractive in Baldur's Gate 3 is that so much work was put into their character design, seen clearly in the difference between character models in the early access version and the alpha, and a production team that probably had more people working on just cinematics than the entirety of Avowed's 80-person development staff. But I find it interesting that this is such a flashpoint, because if I were to identify my biggest problem with the main story is that it doesn't let ideology play center stage. I don't necessarily mean real-world political ideology, but just having factions that have a worldview that is critiqued throughout the game, that the player can interact with their own morals to figure out whether they believe in it or not. Avowed is engaging with some pretty big real-world stuff, like colonization, and potentially having to make alliances of convenience with larger groups that don't have your best interest at heart. There's enough work put into it that shows a lot of talent at hand, but it never really gets to play center stage. And I think both the fanatical pro-colonization messages of the Steel Garrote and the anti-Adir messages have to take a back seat to really simplistic moral quandaries and stuff that's equivalent to like the trolley problem. The resolution of Act 1 is a great example of this. You investigate the home of the now deceased Claviger, who was the old governor of Paradis and the greatest authority figure there that wasn't from Adir. You discover that after initially working with Adir, he began to see a pattern of them increasing their control and started to secretly support the militias that you learn also killed you at one point. You learn that a character previously talked about positively had something in common with the people who are supposedly your mortal enemies. This is fascinating, and it's a potential pivot point for the player to decide where they stand relative to the empire that set them on this journey. The Paradis militia are violent, they're killing people, but there was ample evidence, at least for me, that their actions against Adir have justification when they're imposing their laws against people and maybe murdering civilians, with a clear intention to continuously expand their influence. Unfortunately, the game mostly sidesteps that conversation. The whole lead up to the area boss is Kai and Marius arguing over the nature of forgiveness or precaution, which is in line with their characters up to that point, but just so much not the problem at hand. The conflict here is about the convictions of the Paradis resistance, and as it's explained, I don't really give a shit that my character almost died. It wasn't about me, it was about Adir, and so making this into a personal conflict is kind of hollow. The game also offloads your assassin's motivations for killing you onto religious conviction rather than a perception that you represent the Adiran Empire. Whether you choose to listen to his eventual apologies and spare him or kill him is also made about him. I spared him, and even future Paradis militia characters I encountered referred to him as some kind of crazy fanatic. And from what I understand, while there are some benefits, even if you do kill him, a lot of those characters will forgive you as well. The thing is, understanding the full dimension of why someone might take up arms against Adir is something I gathered from a variety of conversations and reading all the lore I could get my hands on. The philosophical dimensions of why two factions war is harder to pick up when you're skipping through cutscenes to get to fights or listening to a podcast in the background. The dichotomy of forgiveness and revenge is pretty easy to grasp, and unfortunately, it's the note that Act 1 leaves out on. I was overall disappointed with how my game interacted with my decision from this point on to sabotage Adir at every turn. While there was always some dialogue to go that direction, I never found the game let much ride on understanding that nuance besides some side quest solutions. I don't know how the evil Steel Garrote path feels, but I also found myself frustrated that the Adiran non-Steel Garrote presence never really found its footing either. And the question of whether the most high-minded aspirations of Adirans can really overcome their reality of colonization. But there was enough effort put in that I get the sense the people that made Avowed did want to engage with some of those themes for the people paying attention. But there are a lot of other things I was so impressed with in this game going forward. And so next week, I'm gonna go really spoilery on this and talk about both the great way some of the story cliche in the beginning develop and how this game has maybe the most interesting side quest thing I've seen in an RPG since maybe The Witcher 1. So stay tuned for that next week.